I have to warn the Soviets, in the clearest possible terms, that they risk taking us to the brink of an armed confrontation with incalculable consequences for all mankind.
In 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, one in Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki. To this day, this has thankfully remained the only use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict, but that isn't to say we haven't come close. Ever since World War II, with the human population now aware of the destruction these weapons can bring, the threat of further nuclear war has been a looming presence. Today it seems like a fairly unlikely scenario, but in the decades after World War II, nuclear war was something many people feared could break out at any moment. The movie Threads asks the question, what if nuclear war did break out sometime after World War II, specifically the 80s during the Cold War? The film explores an alternate timeline to our own, one in which the United States and the Soviet Union have an armed conflict that escalates to nuclear war. And in the midst of this, several nuclear bombs sent by the Soviet Union are detonated in England. It's a pretty interesting what if, and in this video we'll discuss how well the movie explores this idea. This is Threads. The movie opens up with a little montage of sorts, with shots of a spider sewing a web mixed in with shots of a functioning urban society. The narrator talks about how the connections, or threads, that hold society together are also what make it vulnerable. I like openings like this that use a concept in nature to let you in on what the theme of the movie is supposed to be. If you've ever seen the movie Vivarium, then you've seen another example of an opening like this. There's an almost documentary-like feel in some parts of the film. The narrator will come in every now and then to explain something, such as like the government's policy on who has the power during a major crisis. And there will also be text blurbs that explain what natural resources and industries a certain place has, and therefore what will be lost in the blast. It can be a little jarring sometimes, and part of me wishes they showed a little more and told a little less when it came to this stuff. But another larger part of me appreciates what it's going for, and I think it brings home the documentary feel quite well. Anyway, the main characters of the film are Ruth Beckett, played by Karen Meager, and Jimmy Kemp, played by Reese Dinsdale. They play a typical young couple, impulsive and in love, spending their time doing things such as sitting in their car, listening to the radio, and having lots of sex. In fact, near the start of the movie, we learn that Ruth is pregnant and the couple are going to move in together, which they do, and we see a scene in which Ruth expresses that she's optimistic about the future and she just knows everything is going to be okay. I guess it just goes to show that following your gut isn't always the best move. The movie has a slow build-up, which I like. It takes its time letting you know what these people's lives are like, how the society holds itself together, and ultimately, the way of life that is soon to be erased. It shows people going about their daily lives as usual, all while tuning into the radio now and then to listen to the ongoing crisis between the US and Soviet Union, or simply ignoring it. I can appreciate that some characters are very interested in watching or hearing the news, while other characters flip by to hear about sports and whatever. It definitely is like this in real life. Some people don't care about the news or would rather shut it out than be bothered by it all the time, which is understandable. On that note, I think the movie does a great job of depicting the escalation of an armed conflict and how television stations will cover them. It starts out with stories of like tensions rising, and then stories on troops being sent out, with one country hoping the other will pull out. Then it escalates to actual battling, and then, of course, nuclear war. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. I just wanted to make a comment on, I think the news coverage is depicted in a realistic way. And the characters themselves react with the news too, in words and in action. At the start of the film, people casually listen to the radio, or like I said, they'll ignore it outright. But as things escalate, people pay more and more attention to it. There's a scene in a bar where the news is on in the background of everyone drinking and talking, and when they say something particularly scary on the TV, everyone quiets down and focuses in. The bartender takes this as a sign to change the channel, but everyone shouts at him to change it back because they want to see what they're talking about. At this point in the movie, people have started to get very worried, and they can't ignore the news anymore, and I like that little detail. Side note that I thought was worth mentioning, as an American, I know what it's like to live in a country that is a major superpower, for better or for worse. I see the world react and change based on decisions that my government makes, and it can be a bit surreal sometimes. This movie obviously is set in the UK, which is certainly not a microscopic entity on the world stage, but it is not in the same shoes as the US, which arguably has more influence in the world. I say all this to bring attention to the fact that the characters in this movie are going through all of this stress, worrying about the news, some families even fleeing their homes, all because of the actions of other nations that they have nothing to do with. Other than being, like, allies with one of them. But, you know what I mean. The people in this film are in fear of their lives, and, their whole way of life is at stake because two separate world superpowers are at each other's throats, and they just happen to be caught in the middle. This fact alone makes this movie all the more scary to me. It just makes the characters feel that much more powerless. And their government doesn't do a stupendous job of helping them out either. We see a scene where Clive Sutton, a government official who's usually relatively low on the totem pole nationally, but who is given more power due to the crisis, like I mentioned earlier, he hears that a major attack is coming. He calls a bunch of people to his office and he starts taking inventory on resources, yada yada. But what I really want to talk about is what happens with all the roads and people trying to evacuate the cities. Soon after Clive's phone call, most of the main roads are blocked off to let official traffic come through. So thousands of people trying to flee to somewhere safer are cut off and have to stay put. They can't even leave the area. Clive and his team know an attack is incoming, or at least is very likely, but they're preventing people from leaving. And for what? What is this quote-unquote official traffic that needs all the roads to themselves? They don't really say. I understand in a crisis like this, resources are going to have to be moved around, but do you need all the roads? And do people have to stay put indefinitely? Like, you can't let some of them through? It just seems wrong to try to keep people in place when a nuke is coming. It just seems backwards. Side note, one of the families that, like I mentioned, fled the city, almost left their dog behind because they were in such a hurry. The father was the most in a hurry and wasn't even willing to wait a couple of minutes for the dog to show up. It was about to drive off when it just happened to run up to them. I mention this because it's a good example of them showing instead of telling. I mentioned earlier that sometimes I wish they would show a little more and tell a little less, but there are plenty of examples of them doing just that. And I just wanted to point that out because this particular scene, it highlights the desperation of the citizens, and I felt it was necessary to give credit where credit is due. Anyway, after a while, the US and the Soviets start actually exchanging fire, and this is when we get the grocery store scene. There are people shopping and standing in line, and a guy walks in from off the street. He yells to his mom that
"They've started fighting, Mum. The Americans and the Russians."
This is when she, along with all the other shoppers, rush out with their full carts, refusing to pay. This is the beginning of the end, and people are putting survival above manners and above the law. Now, up to this point, the movie had been very tense. It really set up a feeling in me that something big was coming. Obviously I knew that a bomb was going to drop at some point, but I didn't know exactly where it would drop, and more importantly, when it would drop. I found myself hoping that it would be sudden and catch me off guard. I didn't want to see the view of the people launching the nukes. I didn't want to see any aerial shots. I wanted to be just as caught off guard as the citizens of the city. And I'm happy to say that the film does a great job of doing exactly this. It's not quite as sudden as it could have been, but the way they do it is realistic, and about as sudden as it would be in real life, as far as I can tell. Let me explain. Shortly after the grocery store scene, we get one from a makeshift underground office that Clive Sutton and his team have set up. An alert goes off warning them of an attack warning red, which the viewer is led to assume means the nuke is on the way. The next scene is of the general public reacting to the same news, and their warning is the citywide alarm systems. The nukes really do come about maybe 20-30 seconds after the alarms start going off. So I had it in my head that the nuke scene would be more sudden than this. Like, we'd be watching a scene of people talking or working or whatever, and then all of a sudden it just explodes in the background with no signs at all that it was about to happen. This would have been cool, but the way they did it was more realistic, so I can definitely appreciate it. It's not like there was a huge notice ahead of the bomb dropping. Like, the viewer found out when the attack warning red went off in the office, and then it's maybe about 40-50 seconds after that the bomb drops in the movie. And the people on the street, like I said, maybe had like a 20-30 second notice. So yeah, it's not like there was a huge notice ahead of the bomb dropping, but it wasn't quite as sudden as I wanted it to be. But there are alarms like this in real life designed to warn of an incoming nuclear attack, so if anything, the few seconds of notice they get adds to the tension and realism of the movie. In any case, we've reached the point in the movie, about halfway in, where the bombs are on their way. The aforementioned alarms start sounding, and we see one of our main characters, Jimmy, and his friend Bob, and as the alarm is blaring in the background, they all slowly make the realization that the nukes are actually coming, right now, and they start to take cover. We see people scrambling and yelling in the streets, running into the nearest buildings, and then it happens. The first nuclear bomb goes off above the North Sea, taking out most electronics and communications across Britain and Northwest Europe. Those in Clive Sutton's underground office scramble to organize in the panic, and then another nuke goes off, taking out NATO military targets. Many people are blinded by the light, and we get several scenes of people reacting to and being pushed around by the blast. Two of the people we get to see react are Jimmy and Bob. Jimmy, in a panic, tries to start his car, but it won't work, so he runs off to find Ruth. Bob's reaction is probably my favorite in the whole film. He just stands there and stares at the huge mushroom cloud and says,
They've done it.
This is a guy who, during the bar scene, joked about how drunk he intended on being if and when the bomb dropped, clearly not wanting to take it seriously, but now that it has, he's not joking around anymore. 9 million people die instantly. We see Jimmy running through the streets, and then cut to Rose and her family in her house. Rose's family is begging her to come help her grandmother, and it takes them asking several times for her to break out of her racing thoughts and go help. The whole area is in chaos. People are running for cover, falling over each other, and then things get even worse.
Michael!
210 megatons fall on the UK, turning it from a society in chaos into a lifeless wasteland. There's fire everywhere, people are buried under tons of rubble, their skin charred and falling off. Cats and dogs lay dying in the streets. Nobody is safe from the devastating destruction that has been brought by nuclear war. This is the point in the movie where the atmosphere becomes completely different. No longer are we watching people go about their daily lives. There are no more talks of couples moving in together, no more trips to the pub, only ash, death, sickness, and suffering. Clive Sutton's underground office is still working, but one of the members has died from falling debris. Jimmy's mom and dad are holed up in what remains of their house, horribly burnt and struggling to breathe. Ruth and her family are a bit better off, not having sustained any major injuries, but their house has also taken major damage, and not even they are safe from the new threat that is soon to make this nightmare of a situation even more unmanageable, that being nuclear fallout. In short, fallout is radioactive material from a nuclear explosion that is mixed with dust and debris and has been thrown up into the air by the blast. This dust will blow around in the wind and it comes back down to Earth. And there's so much of it that you really can't help but breathe it in if you're anywhere near the blast. Radioactive fallout can make you deathly sick in the short term and the long term, and it can even lead to genetic defects in children for generations. Now that the blasts have come and gone, this is the main source of strife for the people of the UK, along with food and water shortages. I'd say that the movie does a great job of depicting this new way of life post-bombing. The sets are dark and filled with smoke, and the actors do a very convincing job of showing their dread with the situation. I also like how many different perspectives we get to see during this arc of the movie. We get to see the perspectives of average citizens, but we also get to see the government folks underground making decisions about how the UK will proceed from here on. Who will get rations and how much? How will reconstruction be organized? It provides a stark contrast to the people on the surface whose main focus is trying to survive. The government folks have to survive with what they have as well, especially because they're sort of caved in. But they also have a job to do, which leads them to making terrible but arguably necessary decisions like giving 1,000 calories a day to people who can work and only 500 to those who can't. And they even throw around the idea of only giving food to those who can work and letting the others starve. You know, we're truly in tragic times when decisions like this are being made. And you can see that they hate to have to make them at all.
Bastards!
The movie does a good job of showing, not telling, during these scenes. People are walking around without shirts on, they're becoming increasingly stressed and having outbursts, etc. I think it's very realistic to show that people would throw out social conventions like keeping your cool or giving a damn about keeping your shirt on in a situation like this. And I appreciate this attention to detail. Above ground, people are struggling to preserve what little resources they have left, and the ones that remain are mostly tainted. We see a scene where Jimmy's dad drinks some water trickling off of some rubble, only to immediately spit it out due to how rancid it is. The entire area and its resources have been destroyed, and all that remains is a corrupted, radioactive wasteland. I think the scene that conveys this feeling the best is the one in which Ruth leaves her house and walks through what remains of her neighborhood. We see her walking among the rubble, looking at the devastation around her, and this is what she sees.  ' This shot in particular is very powerful. Not only does it convey to the viewer the psychological damage that the people of the UK are going through, but it also must be quite the sight for Ruth specifically to be seeing. Remember that Ruth is an expecting mother. She's going to have her baby soon, whether she likes it or not, and that baby's future is uncertain. Will there be another blast? Will her baby end up like this one? Will her baby be born with the deformities caused by radiation? Is the world as we know it even one in which a baby could grow up to be happy? And there's no telling what her baby's life will be like, but she knows for sure that it won't be anything like the one she wanted for it. The rest of the movie is pretty much just more of this dread. The government withholds rations and saves most of them for people who can work. Soldiers roam the streets, arresting quote-unquote looters who are simply trying to survive, only to turn around and keep for themselves the food that they confiscate. People try to leave the area, but the government UK is in a state of perpetual dread and heavy government control, and the only thing people care about anymore is food. The population has been reduced to that of medieval times, and nothing matters except work and survival. There's one more thing I'd like to discuss before wrapping things up, and that's the story of Ruth's baby. Ruth does end up giving birth successfully, and the baby is not deformed, so that's good. She has to do this alone and on a pile of hay, but neither she or the baby die in the process. So, things are going alright. Ruth does her best to raise the child in this new world, but she can only do so much. Yet another thing I'd like to praise this movie on is the fact that it shows the story of Ruth's baby progressing long after the blast to 13 years into the future. At 10 years, we get to see Ruth's baby as a child, although the actress who plays her looks a little older to me, significantly older, and it's kind of weird. Maybe they couldn't find a child. She doesn't have that many lines. I don't know. It seems like they could have found a better actress to play the 10-year-old. But anyway, this is when we are treated to another very powerful and emotional scene. Ruth and her child are working in a field when Ruth collapses on the ground. She is taken to a bed, laid down, and we see her in this decrepit. Actually ends up dying right then and there. In response to this, the child stares blankly at her mom, takes some of her things, and then walks out. I'm not sure exactly what their lives had been like in the last decade, but if this is how a child reacts to her mother dying in front of her, then I can't imagine it's been too cheery. In this moment, with so few words spoken, this film conveys to the viewer just how much has been lost. Not only have millions of people died, but their entire way of life has been destroyed. A mother and a child cannot even form a bond together in this world as it is now, because all that is left is sickness and the struggle to survive. To me, this is the most impactful scene in the entire film. The movie doesn't go on much longer than this, but I will say that it follows Ruth's daughter's story a little further into her future. I think I'll leave it at that though, because what I'd really like is for you to check out the film for yourself and see what happens with her. One last side note, have you noticed that I haven't mentioned Jimmy since the scene where he runs off to find Ruth back during the initial blasts? This is because, unless I missed something, that is the last scene in which he is shown. It might seem like an oversight to just drop a main character like that and stop following his story so abruptly, but I like to think this was a deliberate choice. In 1945, when the US dropped their nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were thousands of people going about their daily lives just like the people in this film, and they didn't even have an alarm. There weren't plaques made or statues built to represent each one of them. Many of their names are not known to anyone, their lives cut short and erased by nuclear war. This is what happened to Jimmy. Again, I may have missed something and he actually was shown in a later scene, but as far as I can tell, he was erased from the world the moment the third bomb dropped. The fact that this film does this really hits home for me. It makes you feel the sudden loss of life, the people whose futures are taken from them, their names erased from history in an instant. It's just one more thing this movie does to drive home the dread of the whole situation. So, that's Threads in a nutshell, and what a film it is. I've seen a lot of disaster movies in my day, but not many of them have been able to evoke such a sense of sorrow in me like this one did. 28 Days Later does a pretty good job of this, but most disaster movies that I've seen focus mostly on the spectacle that disaster can bring. And that's entertaining in its own right, but scenes of cities falling apart and floods drowning thousands of people don't really mean anything without the human aspect being focused on. Threads isn't just a film about a big bomb. It's a film about the daily lives of people being upended and fundamentally changed forever. It's a story about how the decisions of a few world leaders with too much power can lead to devastation for millions of people, and just how deeply that devastation seeps into the human experience. War is pain, and nuclear war is the most extreme form humankind is capable of. As destructive as conventional warfare can be, all the horrible things that come with it are amplified to their limits when weapons of this caliber are in the picture. And the scariest part of this movie is that it isn't science fiction. This isn't some grandiose story about a Mayan prophecy or an alien empire invading the planet. This is a story that could happen today in our world. The weapons that caused the suffering seen in this film are ones that our governments have access to, and there's not really anything we can do about that. Sure, we can vote, we can run for office, we can protest and make our voices heard, but nothing is going to change the fact that nuclear weapons are here, and they're here to stay. The fact that one country has nukes means that everyone has to have nukes to potentially counter them. It's not as if everyone is suddenly going to agree that we shouldn't use them anymore, and every nuke on Earth is going to be destroyed, never to be replaced again. The fact that these kinds of weapons exist means that all the world's largest nations feel the need to have them, or else they're unprepared for the possibility of this happening to them. Nuclear weapons never should have been invented, but they were, and they exist in our world right now. They could be used at any moment, maybe even where you live, and it's beyond your power to prevent that. This is the true horror of Threads.